Hey there everyone, my name is Waffles the Asian Yenbear and I play One Piece here in Japan. If I was able to get this video edited in time, OP-05 should be about to hit the rest of the world real soon. So today I'm going to give you the lowdown on what decks perform the best in Japan, what new decks to watch out for, how some old decks might be changing, and what could be an interesting rogue pick to bring to your local tournament. I have played a bunch of different decks over the course of this meta, on top of cataloging every possible deck list I could find on One Piece top decks into a spreadsheet, formatted it by leader, calculated the average usage rates of every card that saw play, as well as the win rates for each leader, and I have even ranked the leaders based on how good they are. Seriously, a lot of work went into the spreadsheet, and you can find it linked down in the description and also in the pinned comment. I encourage you to check it out after you're done with this video. I did my best to try to make that into an accessible resource for you all, and I hope it helps. Now let's get into this. OP-05 brought a bunch of power creep in the form of 3 insane leaders. You've got Yellow Enel, Purple Luffy, and Blue-Black Sakazuki, each quickly becoming the go-to choice for a certain style of play. Aggressive players gravitated towards Purple Luffy, mid-range players stuck with Yellow Enel, and control players had an absolute blast with Sakazuki. So here's essentially how each one works. Purple Luffy's leader effect allows you to add an active Dawn in exchange for taking 1 life. This allowed Purple to seriously start ramping very quickly. That combined with the new blocker Captain Kid enabled the deck to use Purple's trademark Dawn minus skills without falling behind in resources. So this led to players using essentially a good stuff's purple deck. For those who are unfamiliar with the term, that means they just put generally good purple cards in there without really sticking to any particular archetype. Thankfully, that leaves a lot of flexibility for how these players can build their decks, but you'll see a vast majority of Luffy players using the starter deck Queen and the new Captain Kid as blockers at 4 copies each. Most are going to use the starter deck Kaido as their boss drop, but a few also tech in the new Gear 5 10 cost Luffy as well. Most run Kaido at 3 to 4 copies and Luffy at 1 to 2. You're also going to see Page 1 and Ulti from the starter deck, since Ulti provides a 2k counter, and you can get both of those characters out early on for very cheap. The deck runs a ton of 2k counters, often running 12 to 16, as Purple has a lot to choose from. However, when it comes to events, you only really see Blast Breath, Gumma Gumma no Jet Gatling, and the occasional Hell's Judgment. Purple Luffy decks are mainly just trying to stay ahead of the Dawn curve, and they accomplish that by ramping Dawn with Luffy and some other cards, but also by slowing their opponents down with cards like Magellan and Polly. It's a very aggressive playstyle, but that is a double-edged sword. If they run into an opponent who can slow the game down and pressure their hand resources, they usually can't keep the game up, especially with that early loss of life from Luffy's leader skill. Sakazuki has a pretty good time against Luffy's, as they can keep Luffy from building up their board, but will struggle if they can't deal with the Kaidos in the late game. Enel has a hard time if Luffy goes wide, but if they can make it to the end game, Enel can turn the tides pretty easily. Green Uda does a great job of blocking a lot of Luffy's big threats and keeping pressures on their counters until they crack. This might be an unpopular opinion, but I'm gonna gas the hell out of Uda because I think she has a really good matchup against most of the big decks. Enel's leader ability activates on your opponent's turn when you drop to 0 life. It lets you discard a card to add the top card of your deck to your life. It can activate once per turn, so essentially you've got an extra life every turn. Now, Enel came with some Sky Island support, but only a few of them are of note, so most Enel decks played a mix of Big Mom Pirates and Sky Island. Essentially, it's what you'd expect to see in Katakuri and OP-04, plus buffed a little bit. Some of those buffs include Ohm and Holly. Ohm lets you look at the top 5 cards of your deck on play, add a Holly to your hand, then play a Holly from your hand. So even if you don't take a Holly from the deck, if you have one in your hand, there you go. That was a big deal because you essentially got 2 5k characters for 4 Dawn, which really helps support yellow decks in the early game. There's also Gedatsu, which saw a ton of play, and he's a 4-cost 6k character that lets you KO a character with equal or less cost to your opponent's life, so he's pretty great as an offensive threat in the early game for these Enel decks. One other Sky Island character you can expect to see is Satori, a 2k counter 5k character who has Trigger, trash a card from your hand to play him. When it comes to Enel decks, you're going to see those and easily 4 copies of 8C Katakuri and 9C Yamato. You've got some 7C Linlins in there and blockers with play this card triggers like Sanji and Brule. Enel has a lot of longevity, but he tends to struggle a lot against small attacks. The longer the game goes on for Enel, the better their chances are of winning, so decks that can beat them usually are either very fast or very good at sustaining resources. Sakazuki has been endlessly talked about, and for good reason. His leader ability is to trash a card from your hand to draw a card once per turn, but also, when he attacks, he drops the cost of one character on your opponent's field by 1. This set comes with a lot of support for this deck, and it pulls the entire Navy archetype together. So here's basically how it works. Sakazuki goes second. You play an early game character. They play Hound Blaze and your character is in the bottom of your deck while you get hit with an 8 to 10k attack to the face. You play another character on your next turn. They play Great Eruption to lower the cost by 2 and rob Lucci to KO it. And on and on. There's a few main combos that you're going to need to know. Rebecca, when she's played, pulls Hina from the trash and then plays her from the hand, which lowers one of your character's cost by 3. Then Hound Blaze, Borsellino, 3000 Worlds, or rob Lucci to then remove it. The good Sakazuki decks ran 4 Lucci, 3 to 4 Borsellino, 4 Rebecca, and 4 Hina. They also tend to run 4 copies of Sudu and starter deck Tashigi for 2k counters, and 4 blocker Borsellino and 4 Sabo for blockers. Their goal is to control the board and gain advantage by removing your cards while playing their own. So the way to beat them is usually just to deny them from doing that, or to bait them into wasting their resources on cards you really don't care about. Against a Sakazuki, I'd recommend almost any deck to just turn 3 or 4, whichever turn you get to attack first on for you, attach 3 to 4 Dawn, and just swing with your leader. They're usually going to let you take the life, and then they have to figure out what they want to do when you don't have anything to remove. Sakazuki's biggest weakness is leader swings, and if you can deal with their blockers, you can end them. They rely on you to play the game normally, so if you choose not to like an insane person, you put them in a tough spot. There's one leader that does an especially great job of this. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge. So those are the big 3, and unfortunately, they're all pretty expensive to build. I'd recommend picking a deck based on whatever archetype you already have the base cards for from other decks, and then picking your favorite playstyle from those. If you want some help learning how to pilot them, check back to this channel soon. I'm planning to have guides on all 3 of those decks within the first week or so of the set dropping. Now when it comes to the other major decks, we saw a pretty big meta shift. The existence of Sakazuki greatly hurt Zoro and Red-Green Law, although they do still do decently in the other matchups. We don't see many new cards showing up in the Zoro decks outside of the new Fire Fist event, basically replacing the older version. Law likewise only had starter deck 10 Jinbei showing up in his lists, and even then that's only about 28% of the time. The main thing that changes for these two is a bit about how they're piloted. Zoro decks have to be a little bit more careful about which cards they play early in the Sakazuki matchup, and Law kind of just gets fucked versus Sakazuki. But on the few times they're able to pull a win out, it's usually because they put out more cards than Sakazuki can remove. We also saw Katakuri still doing well, but as far as deck lists go, it's mainly the same as Enel. The only real difference we see is that Katakuri runs 10C Big Mom, since she needs your leader to be a Big Mom pirate. Yellow players mainly just need to consider that and the trade-off between bigger leader swings with Katakuri or more longevity with Enel. Red and purple Luffy actually has the biggest change out of the older leaders. You tend to see him running about half of what mono purple Luffy does and half of the Straw Hat Zoro base. As a 6k leader, he is able to hold his own a bit in the meta. Now when it comes to other leaders in the set, a lot has been made about Bello Betty. On the surface, she can be a very aggressive deck, aiming to finish the game in a few turns, but she didn't really make it past rogue status as her deck burns through resources super quickly. Given that Enel and Sakazuki were pretty dominant, she just really didn't have a favorable metagame to play in. Sabo is the other revolutionary leader who excels at keeping his characters from being KO'd, but honestly that just doesn't help much when the enemy wants to bottom deck them or just run right past them, like those big leaders did. And Corazon is just bad. He won 2 standard battle tournaments and that's it. You really don't need to worry about Rosinante in your prep. However, there were 2 leaders that came out in the middle and end of the meta, and one I've been hinting at in the most unsubtle way possible. Green Uda takes the already great film engine and makes it even more consistent. With only about a month and a half, she did better than Zoro and almost as good as Red Green Law. She isn't out yet for the Western meta, and I'll cover her more when she drops, but the biggest thing to point out here is that she was able to take the film engine's ability to go wide and add on tall leader hits to close out games, which matched up incredibly well versus the big three, especially due to her card, I'm Invincible, which is a terrible English name. It's so bad. I hate it, but that is a whole other topic we can talk about later. You've also got Sanji and Zoro and started at 12, but they didn't really see any real showing. They came out right near the end of the meta, so we're gonna have to wait to see how they fare in OP-06. As far as rogue decks I haven't mentioned yet, Queen and Red Purple Law are actually pretty decent. Queen continues to do what he does, but starts to incorporate cards like 2k counter Garp, Gidatsu, and 200 million volt Amaru. Red Purple Law gets a ton of support in this set, and frankly, if you like playing the deck when Starter Deck 10 came out, I would really recommend it. It is so much better and it is still very fun. However, it does struggle against the big three and thus is still trapped in rogue status. Now when it comes to deck rankings, like the last time I did this, I used a weighted ranking system. Standard battle wins are worth 1 point each, flagship 3-on-3 and preliminaries for championship tournaments are worth 2 points each, along with getting into the top 32 of any championship tournament. And if you happen to win the whole thing, that deck got 5 points. With that in mind, first place goes to Purple Luffy with 117 points, followed by Sakazuki in a close second with 99 points. Then there's a pretty big drop to third place with Enel at 60 points. Katakuri falls behind with 42 points. Red Green Law and Red Purple Luffy are a very close 5th and 6th place at 32 and 31 respectively, and lastly we have a similar close 7th and 8th with Uda and Zoro at 22 and 21. When it comes to colors, purple dominates this meta, with almost all purple players using Luffy. Yellow comes in second as both Enel and Katakuri were very strong. Outside of a few leaders, anyone who was playing blue or black tended to jump on Sakazuki, so those combined for third place. Red does take some heavy hits this meta, but it brings it more in line with the other colors compared to how strong it was in the last meta. Green starts to see a bit more resurgence, especially with Uda, but it's going to be a bit longer before it has its chance in the spotlight. My name is Waffles the Asian Yenbear, and if you liked the video, go ahead and hit that like button for me. My goal for OP-05 is to make a guide video for every leader in the game, so if you're interested in that, you should subscribe and let me know what you want to see first. As I mentioned before, I should have guides on Sakazuki, Enel, and Luffy pretty soon after the set drops, but I kinda haven't decided which one to release after that, so let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I hope you have a good day, a good week, a good life, and now, goodbye.